Hi there, my name is Ryan Dickerson. I'm a student in Brady School of Medicine, class 2025, and this is our embryology video for the development of the skull, pituitary, face, and palate. As always, here's the mission statement. Again, Scrubs is a student-driven initiative that aims to develop supplemental resources for current and future cohorts that will pass through Brody, and we work to do this to help exemplify the unique collaborative community that Brody can offer and help promote other medical students through their journey in medical school. As always, we have a disclaimer that these resources are supplemental and in no way a replacement for the instruction by your Brody faculty. However, we do hope that these resources aid you in your journey. With that, we're going to go ahead and dive into the material. So thinking about where we're at in development, we're looking at the development of the face, pituitary. This is really starting around the 4th and 5th weeks of life. This is when really all your major organ systems are starting to form. At this point, we've got the head fold coming down, the tail fold coming up. So we're starting to see a structure that is somewhat beginning to look recognizable, much different than our trilaminar and bilaminar disc. So this is kind of our idea in place. Remember, we have our pharyngeal apparatus that's starting to form, the head fold's coming down, and this video is really going to be primarily focused on how the region of the head and neck is going to develop. So let's start with the skull. So there are going to be two major components of the skull that we need to define, and that is going to be the neurocranium and the viscerocranium. The neurocranium refers to all of the bones that surround the brain. So neuro, think nervous tissue such as the brain, cranium, so the bones surrounding the brain. Now, there are going to be membranous and cartilaginous components. We'll talk about that in a future slide. But the bones that are going to be surrounding the brain that you need to know. You have your frontal bone. You have your parietal bone. You have your occipital bone, your ethmoid, your sphenoid, and your temporal bones. So these are all bones that are surrounding the brain, and so therefore these are going to collectively be known as the neurocranium. Now the bones of the face, however, are going to be known as the viscerocranium. Okay, so bones of the face, viscerocranium. Once again, there's going to be membranous and cartilaginous components, which we're going to talk about in future slides. But the big bones here to know, you've got your maxilla, your mandible, your lacrimal bones, your nasal bones, zygomatic, and orbital bones. Okay, so these are the big bones that are going to be forming your viscerocranium. And we're going to go more into each one of these slides moving forward. So thinking about your neurocranium, we mentioned again that the neurocranium refers to all of the bones that are surrounding the skull. So we're going to break this down into two components. We're going to call this the cartilaginous neurocranium and the membranous neurocranium. And the reason for this is because the cartilaginous neurocranium is going to develop via endochondral ossification. And if we remember what endochondral ossification means, that means that we're going to form a cartilage base that will eventually be replaced by bone. That's different than the membranous neurocranium, which is going to be developing by intramembranous ossification. This means you go directly from that mesenchymal template to bone with no cartilage intermediate. So that's the big difference between endochondral and intramembranous ossification. So with that kind of in mind, that's the process by which these bones develop. Let's think about the difference in the actual bones themselves. So for the cartilaginous neurocranium, these are all those bones that are forming the base of the skull. So this is going to include your ethmoid bones, your sphenoid, your temporal, and your occipital bones. So again, you have your occipital bones, you have your temporal bones, sphenoid, and ethmoid. So this is really forming the base of the skull. Okay. I do want to point out that this occipital bone, this is in the region around the foramen magnum, as opposed to getting the cartilaginous neurocranium that we're talking about here. They're gonna have derivatives from paraxial mesoderm, and that's just specifically around the region of the foramen magnum, which is the region or the opening where we allow for the nervous system to pass from the brain into the spinal cord. All right, so that's a quick overview of our cartilaginous neurocranium. It's also known as our chondrocranium. All right. Thinking about our membranous neurocranium, that forms the rest of our skull. And really it's going to be forming the cavera, or the vault of the skull, and there we're looking at our parietal bones and our frontal bones. Okay, so with that, we can see that our membranous neurocranium is forming two major structures, our parietal bones, one on either side, our frontal bones, which also in development are going to have one on either side, whereas everything else is forming from the bones that surround the brain is going to be derived from cartilaginous neurocranium, right? And that's kind of the big takeaways from neurocranial development. Now, kind of with that in mind, as these bones are developing, these bones are going to develop separately, and eventually they're going to fuse in the adult. Now, before they fuse, we have what we call sutures, and this is spaces between the bones. So a couple of sutures you need to know is a coronal suture. The coronal suture passes all the way across the superior pole of the head and is separating the frontal bones and the parietal bones. We have the sagittal suture, which is separating the two parietal bones. In the back, we have the lambdoid suture, which is separating the parietal bones from the occipital bone. The frontal suture is separating our two frontal bones, which will eventually fuse. And then we have a squamous suture, which is located laterally. This is going to be between the temporal bone and the parietal bones. Okay, so these are the different sutures of the skull. What's important that we recognize is that when the sutures intersect and come together, there's going to be a big open space, and we're going to call these spaces fontanelles. Okay, so the fontanelles is kind of the intersection of these sutures, and it forms an open space where there's no bone. And what this allows, without the skull being fused when you're in embryo, it allows for your skull to deform during the birthing process so that it's easier to pass through the vaginal canal. Once you pass through the vaginal canal in the adult, we're going to want these bones to fuse. And so what's really important is these fontanelles are going to be open, as big open soft spots when you're first born, and eventually they're going to close down. And we need to have a general timeline of when these fontanelles are going to close. So the first two fontanelles that are going to close are going to be your sphenoid and posterior fontanelles. So your sphenoid fontanelle is located anteriorly. This is going to be the intersection between the coronal suture and that squamous suture, forming that sphenoid fontanelle. And then your posterior fontanelle is back here at the intersection between the sagittal suture and the lamboid suture. So you can see that in this image as well. So both of these are going to close around the 2nd to 3rd month of life. And your next fontanelle that's going to close is going to be your mastoid fontanelle. Okay, and the mastoid fontanelle is closing around 1 year, and then your anterior fontanelle, which is the one right at the top of the skull, this is between the coronal sutures and frontal suture. This is going to be closing at the 2nd year of life. Okay, so these fontanelles again refer to the big soft spots in the skull that will eventually fuse and form continuous bone at the intersection of these different bones. And so this is the difference between a when you're born and then an adult later on, is the fusion of these sutures and fontanelles. So that's an overview of our neurocranium. So all the bones that surround the skull, how they form, and when we're expecting fusure of the plates. What we also need to think about is the viscerocranium development. And the viscerocranium, again, refers to all of the bones of the face. So you can think of these as your facial bones. Right? Now, again, we're going to break this up into two components. We have a cartilaginous viscerocranium and a membranous viscerocranium. And they're referred to these because there's two different processes by which they are derived. So the cartilaginous viscerocranium is formed via endochondral ossification, which again is a cartilaginous template before it's ossified into bone. And these components are going to be all the components that are derived from the pharyngeal arches. So we can think about the first pharyngeal arch giving rise to the malleus, incus, and sphenomandibular ligament. The second arch giving the stapes, styly process, and portions of the hyoid bone, whereas the third pharyngeal arch is going to give rise to the rest of the hyoid. Okay, so these are all divided by endochondral ossification. And remember, because they're coming from pharyngeal arches, this is derived via neural crest cells that are invading with the mesoderm and forming these components. Now, when we have the membranous viscerocranium, this is all developed by intermembranous ossification. And these are derived from the mandibular maxillary prominences, which is part of that first pharyngeal arch. And this is going to give rise to really the majority of the facial bones that we recognize. Your zygomatic bones, the squamous part of your temporal bone, your mandible, maxilla, nasal, lacrimal, volar, and palatine bones. And you can see all of those indicated in this image. So again, all of these bones of the face primarily are going to be formed by membranous or intermembranous ossification, meaning that they're membranous viscerocranium. But again, really important that we designate this as viscerocranium compared to neurocranium, which refers to all the bones that surround the skull. Okay, so that took us through an overview of the different bones that are going to be formed and the different processes by which they form, whether that is going to be membranous ossification or that's going to be endochondral ossification. Now we need to think about how the actual face is going to form. And the face initially is going to be formed through the development of facial prominences. So there's going to be 5 facial prominences that we need to keep up with. Initially, we're going to have one frontonasal prominence, and it's unpaired, meaning that there's one just right in the middle. We're also going to have 2 maxillary prominences, which are going to start off laterally, and then we're going to have a mandibular prominence. We're actually going to have 2 of these. They're going to come together and join at the midline. During development, all these facial prominences are derived from the first pharyngeal arch, and specifically due to the neural crest cell proliferation within these regions. So the frontonasal prominence, which is up here, will eventually, as we get to the fetus, is going to give rise to the future forehead, the apex of the nose, and portions of the nasal septum. The maxillary prominence, which is shown in purple, is going to give rise to the maxilla, the upper cheek, the upper lips, and your secondary palate. Whereas the mandibular prominence is really forming the lower parts of the face, your chin, your lower jaw, your lower lip, and lower cheek. And this is just a quick overview. We're going to get into more detail in future slides. So in the actual process of the development of the face, there's a couple of things that are happening. So really just starting at the baseline, remember we have 5 facial prominences. We have our frontonasal prominence, we have our maxillary prominences, and we have 2 mandibular prominences that are coming together. Those are all surrounding the oral cavity, which you might also see referred to as stomatum. Okay, so these are different prominences that we have initially. First thing that happens is the frontonasal prominences are going to form nasal placodes. And you can see those in the second image. There are going to be 2 components of the nasal placodes. You're going to have a medial nasal process and a lateral nasal process. In between these, you're going to have what is called the nasal pits. And this is going to be the future site of nose development. Now, as the maxillary prominences grow, they're going to bring these nasal prominences together. So these nasal placodes are coming together, and eventually they're going to fuse at the midline. So these 2 medial nasal processes are fusing because maxillary prominences were forcing them together. So that fusion forms what we're going to call the intermaxillary segment. The intermaxillary segment is going to be the future derivative of the philtrum of the upper lip, which is the region right in the midline of the top lip. All right. The lateral segments of the maxillary prominence is then going to eventually form the lateral regions of the upper lip. Now, this fusion of the maxillary and medial nasal prominences, that is finally separating the nose and the mouth. Okay, so you now have clear designation between the nasal cavities and the oral cavities. Now, during this whole process, as the maxillary process is moving, the kind of groove between the maxillary process and the frontonasal prominence, this is going to be known as the nasolacrimal groove. It is going to invaginate and go underneath the surface of the skin, and it's going to form the nasolacrimal duct. Now, at the very superior poles, near the eyelids, this is where you're going to have the lacrimal sac formed. The groove is going to, up immediately, then it's going to go down along the sides of the nose, and it's going to drain internally into your nasal cavity. All right, and lastly, we're going to have our maxillary prominences, so they're coming together, they're going to join, and they're going to merge to form the chin, the lower lip, and jaw, and then the lateral components are going to fuse up here with the maxillary prominences, and this is going to form regions of your lower cheek as well. All right, so this is a big overview of the development of the face. Big takeaways is that there's 5 facial prominences. The frontonasal prominence is going to give rise to the medial and lateral nasal processes. The medial nasal processes are eventually going to fuse in the midline, forming the intermaxillary segment, which is going to really give rise to the future nose. So now we have lateral segments as well as the nasal pits. And then that intermaxillary segment we'll see coming up in development of the palate as well in the future. So this is kind of the big overview for development of the face. Now, while the face is forming, we're also developing the palate, and the palate refers to the region of the superior oral cavity. So initially, the major components of palate development are all coming from the maxillary prominence. So the first thing that forms is the median palatine prominence, and this is forming directly underneath the region of the intermaxillary segment. So remember that intermaxillary segment that was coming from the fusion of the medial nasal placodes. Okay, so we form that intermaxillary segment. Directly underneath that, we're forming the median palatine process, and that is going to be the eventual primary palate. Okay, so we can see that forming here at the anterior pole of the mouth. So now that the primary palate is forming, the primary palate is going to eventually be everything that is anterior to the incisive foramen. And the incisive foramen is the little hole right here that separates the anterior palate and the posterior palate. All right. Now, the anterior palate you can see in green is really small compared to the major components of our overall adult palate, so we need to form our secondary palate, which is going to be the majority of our upper oral cavity. And so this forms by the lateral palatine prominences. So we have one median forming the primary palate. We're going to have 2 lateral palatine prominences that are going to join together to form the secondary palate. These are going to start off as palatal shelves. So these palatal shelves are going to come together, and they're going to fuse at the midline at the nasal septum. Okay, so their goal is to fuse at the midline at the nasal septum, and then they're going to fuse anteriorly with the primary palate as well. So once the primary and secondary palates fuse, we're going to have our final adult derivatives. So the primary palate is, again, anything anterior to the incisive foramen. The secondary palate has 2 components. We have the anterior half, which is forming the hard palate, which is all bone, which will be ossified in development. And then we have the soft palate, which is everything posterior, and including the uvula. Okay, so this is all soft tissue. So as you can see, the secondary palate forms the majority of the palate in the adult. Everything anterior to the incisive foramen we're going to call the derivative from the median palating process, because that is forming the primary palate. Everything posterior. Has to do with the secondary palatal shells forming the lateral palating processes that eventually fuse at midline with the nasal septum. Continuing on, we also have development of the pituitary gland, and it's important to know that pituitary is also known as the hypophysis. So you may see this term come up. Hypophysis is again just referring to the pituitary gland. And in order to really understand its development, we need to understand a little bit about the adult anatomy, because I think this really aids in understanding the developmental process. So there's two major components to the pituitary. We have an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is known as the adenohypophysis, and the adenohypophysis is a gland. So it's secreting hormones. So hormone secreting gland. So there's a ton of different hormones that secretes. This really goes into the physiology of the pituitary gland. But the big thing here is to note is that there is a gland that is secreting hormones. It is the anterior pituitary, known as the adenohypophysis, and it has a couple of different components. We have the pars distalis, which is the major component of the anterior pituitary. We have the pars intermedia, which is the segment that kind of separates the anterior pituitary from the posterior pituitary. The pars tuberalis is the region that is actually wrapping around the infundibulum, and the infundibulum is just a fancy word for saying the pituitary stalk, so the thing that connects it to the hypothalamus above. Our posterior pituitary is known as the neurohypophysis. And what's important about the posterior pituitary is this is not an actual gland. It's not secreting hormones that it is making. It is storing hormones that are made by the hypothalamus, and then releasing those hormones. So the cell bodies are actually up in the hypothalamus, and the axons just project down to the hypothalamus to release the transmitters. So the two hormones that are made by the neurohypophysis is antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And another name for this is going to be the pars nervosa. So this is this whole posterior region of the pituitary. So big overview: anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is made of a couple different components. We have the pars tubercularis, which is wrapping around the infundibular stalk. We have the intermedia, which is separating the anterior and posterior pituitary, and then the majority of the anterior pituitary is going to be derived from the pars distalis. Okay, kind of with that overview in mind, I think that will really aid us in understanding the developmental process. So in thinking about the developmental process of the pituitary gland, the first thing that happens is in the roof of the mouth, formed by stomidial ectoderm. And remember, the stomo is the meaning of that word is mouth. So with the ectoderm in the mouth, we're going to have what we call the hypophyseal diverticulum. And we talked previously about diverticulum really just referring to an outpouch. And we're actually going to another name for this, a clinical name, is Röntgen's pouch. So Röntgen's pouch is this region here. It's again a derivative of the stomidial ectoderm, and it's forming a diverticulum that's going up towards the skull. Now, the brain is up here on top, so we have the diencephalon, which is a specific brain region. It is going to be giving off the infundibular process, which is again going to be the eventual pituitary stalk. So this is projecting inferiorly. These two regions, Röntgen's pouch and the infundibular process, are going to join together. And this Röntgen's pouch is going to be the eventual anterior pituitary, whereas the infundibular process is going to project into the posterior pituitary. Because remember, the anterior pituitary is made up of gland. It's a secreting gland, it's secreting hormones, and it's producing those hormones itself, while as the posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, is going to be really a projection from the hypothalamus. So it's projecting axons down into this region, as opposed to developing the glands itself. So over time, we are going to have degradation of the diverticulum that's projecting upwards, and we're going to have the anterior pituitary forming, whereas we had the posterior pituitary again being a projection from the diencephalon. Right, and so at the end, we're going to have two major pituitary structures: the adenohypophysis, which is the anterior pituitary, and the neurohypophysis, which is the posterior pituitary. And remember that they are derived from two different components. The anterior pituitary is derived from stomidial ectoderm, whereas the posterior pituitary is derived from the neuroectoderm. And the major components for each one of these, the neurohypophysis is primarily going to be composed of the pars nervosa, and the pars distalis is going to be the major contribution to the adenohypophysis. All right, and that's a brief overview of the pituitary gland development. With all of that in mind, let's go ahead and knock out some clinical anatomy. First thing I want to point out is a group of diseases that we call craniosynostosis. And craniosynostosis means that there is abnormal fusion of the suture lines, causing the skull to alter its development. So break these down based off of the sutures that are going to be fused, and we're just going to go through a couple of these examples here. The first one is scaphocephaly, and this is premature fusion of the sagittal suture, so right down the midline. So you can imagine if the sagittal suture fuses primarily, that only allows the brain to grow forward and backwards, meaning that you're going to have a narrow wedge-shaped skull for future development. Brachiocephaly is when you have the coronal sutures on either side fusing, and this is going to force the skull to grow in a superior direction, which forms a high tower-like head. Next, we have oxocephaly, and this is when you have not only the coronal sutures that fuse up in the front, you also have the occipital or the lamboid suture fusing in the back, which means that really the only way that you can that the skull can grow is straight up in between the parietal bones, which is going to form this pointed skull appearance. Last, we have plagiocephaly, which is most commonly caused by a fetus laying, or an infant laying on their head for too long on one side. This is going to cause the coronal suture on that side to fuse, and this is going to cause kind of a flat skull on the side of fusion, right? And that's plagiocephaly. So the big takeaway here is these are all variations of premature suture closure that is going to cause alterations in the development of the skull. And we classify these diseases in the category of craniosynostosis. All right, next up we have a couple of different alterations in the development of the skull. The first is cranium bifidum. Cranium bifidum is a pathological variation in which we do not have the fusion of the skull at the apex. So this is a defect in the cranium, and it can allow herniation of the brain and the meninges. If it's just the meninges, we're going to call that a meningocele. And if you have the meninges and the brain involved, that's when we get the meningioencephalocele. So the encephalocele refers to the brain tissue. And this most often is associated with failure of correct development of the occipital bones. Next up, we have microcephaly, and microcephaly, the micro meaning small head. So this is abnormal development of the brain. You can see that typically if this was the adult head size, the infant head size, microcephaly refers to a much smaller head, and this is a baby with severe microcephaly. There's a lot of different factors that play into forming a microcephaly. A lot of these are genetic, inherited, and environmental factors. Next, we have microcephaly, and this is also known as anencephaly, and this is kind of the most severe form of poor brain development. It will always be fatal. It's a lethal condition. This is failure of the cranial neuropore to close. So this causes lack of skull development and also lack of the brain formation to fully finish. And that is why this is a lethal condition in utero. All right, next up we have craniopharyngiomas. So a craniopharyngioma is a hormone-secreting tumor, and what's really important to note is that it's derived from remnants of Rothke's pouch, meaning that this is an issue of the development of the pituitary gland. So you have Rothke's pouch, which is that stomedial ectoderm that should form the anterior pituitary, but if somewhere along this path you have a tumor arise, then this is what we're going to call a craniopharyngioma. So this can happen in the pharynx, sphenoid, or sella-turcica, which is all regions surrounding the pituitary gland. All right. So again, a tumor of a derivative of Rothke's pouch is going to be known as a craniopharyngioma, and it's going to be a hormone-secreting tumor because we know Rothke's pouch is developing the anterior pituitary, which secretes a ton of hormones, as it's our master gland in the human body. One really important point when we're thinking about palate development is the possibility for failure of fusion of our palatine prominences, and this is going to lead to cleft lips and cleft palates. So we really classify these as anterior to the incisive foramen and posterior to the incisive foramen, just in terms of location. If it is a cleft lip or palate that is caused by failure of fusion anterior to the incisive foramen, we know that this is a issue with the primary palate. Okay, and this means that we have failure of the maxillary prominences and the median palatine prominence to fuse. Remember that median palatine prominence is kind of fused by the region of the medial nasal placodes when they come together to form the intermaxillary segment. So cleft lip, it could be defined as unilateral, bilateral, and same for cleft of the primary palate, but the important thing here is this is all anterior to the incisive foramen. So the incisive foramen would be right in this region. Our next category is kind of posterior to the incisive foramen, and again, if it's posterior to the incisive foramen, we know that we're dealing with secondary palate anomalies. And so this means that we have failure of the lateral maxillary prominences to fuse with the nasal septum. Okay, and this is going to form clefts of the secondary palate, which can include the hard palate, which we see in yellow. It can also include the soft palate, which we see in blue, which means you can also have something called a cleft uvula, where the uvula itself is actually split into two.